Grace to you and peace from God our Father and our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. So this past week, I flew to and then from Minneapolis. And in both occasions, I got to the gate kind of early, just to sit and watch people. And I made a mental note of the people that I wouldn't mind sitting next to. And then I thought about the people that I not only didn't want to sit next to them, but I also hoped that they even took a different flight. Or maybe a taxi cab. I mean, being totally honest, there are some people, aren't there, that you don't want to sit next to for 4.5 hours in a tightly packed space. I put those people into my God, don't let me sit next to those people category. Have you ever done that? Or am I the only one? I don't really think it would have been fun to sit next to the tax collector in Jesus' story. I do think, however, not so much of a problem sitting next to the Pharisee. Why would I say that? Because the Pharisees in Jesus' day were pretty good people. They were well-respected individuals. The Pharisees were the ones, actually, who were able to maintain faith during the persecution and the fall of Rome in 70 AD. I mean, if it wasn't for the Pharisees, Judaism may have died out altogether. If your kid grew up to want to become a Pharisee, you would be the happiest parent on the block. But I know that Pharisees get a bad rap, don't they? Because in the New Testament, we don't get a good feel about them. And probably for good reason. For a couple of reasons, actually. First of all, the Pharisees were the Jews that the early Christians broke away from in starting this new faith movement. But the Pharisees were also the ones who continually antagonized Jesus. And so in our minds, now 2,000 years later, we kind of put the Pharisees into this category of the bad people. But they really weren't. They were the ones who, again, maintained faith in the face of the hated Roman government. I mean, the Romans wanted to squash the Jewish faith and keep it confined and not allow it to have any power whatsoever. But it was the Pharisees who continually asked people to remember who God was and what God had intended for them to be about. The Pharisees were kind of a middle-of-the-road perspective on faith. Gentle, not strongly forceful. They weren't like the Zealots, who were the right-wing fundamentalists of the day. Nor were they like the Essenes, the kooks that lived out in the desert and separated themselves from everybody else. It was a good thing to be a Pharisee. Modern-day equivalent that I can think of might be just simply somebody who considers themselves devout in their faith. Somebody who takes the Bible seriously. And maybe will on occasion warn other people about what's in the Bible so that those people don't become bad people. But the Pharisees would have been considered pretty good. The tax collectors, on the other hand, not so much. Tax collectors would have been the bad people. They screwed the system for every cent that they could get. They were Jews, but they worked for the Romans. They collected the tax that was asked for from the Roman government, and they padded their pockets with just a little bit more. And in those days, the Jews were being taxed at the rate of 85%. That was a lot. And so if you were a tax collector, you had a good job, but you were not liked by anybody. But it was okay. Because you see, you had the Roman government behind you. They were your strong arm. They were your overlord, and they would make sure nothing would ever bad happen to you. So, all of that becomes the context for this story, this parable that Jesus tells. And the listeners who are listening to this parable, they know that the Pharisees are good people. And they would expect the Pharisee to go down to their home justified, and that the tax collector would not be right with God. But remember, whenever Jesus tells a parable, anything that you expect to have happen, it'll happen differently. Because the element of surprise that Jesus tells in his parables is absolutely critical. And if you're not surprised when you hear a parable of Jesus, then you're probably not hearing it correctly. How can we be surprised in hearing this parable? Roman Catholic theologian by the name of John Dominic Crossan says that maybe it would be better to read it this way. A pope and a pimp went into St. Peter's to pray. I don't know. I think I'm still a little bit too Protestant for that rendition of the story to surprise me too much. So let's push the envelope a little bit. A Lutheran pastor and a disheveled, dirty, smelly traveler boarded the plane together. And sitting next to one another, they silently prayed. Oh, let me tell it even better. A Lutheran gathered on a Sunday morning, dressed in their finest, sitting in worship, confident that God's blessing was upon them, for they were of great stature in the congregation, deeply respected by all, carrying responsibilities across the spectrum in the congregation's ministry. And another individual, one who carried 3 stripes and was facing an uncertain future, sure to struggle with sobriety wherever the government now, the justice system, would send him. Each of them prayed at night their nightly prayers. Jesus, we are told, tells this parable to some who trusted in themselves, thinking that they were pretty good people, and all the while looking down their nose at others who didn't measure up to them. So to drill to the core, it's about judgment. It's about people who judge others as being beneath them. Now that's a reality that every single one of us understands. We know that our world is riddled with judgment, of comparison, of considering oneself or one's group to be above or better than others, or some to feel absolutely inferior to others. And if I could, I would go out on a limb to say that chances are every single one of us has judged another as somehow less than who you are. It's not to say that you would come right out and say, well, that person doesn't measure up to my standards. That person's not as good as me. But what we do is put people in boxes and categorize them, assuming that we know something about them by virtue of the way that they're dressed, the way that they talk, where they live, how they vote, what their arrest record looks like, and all of these other filters that we have grown up with in order to understand who we are in separation from who others are. Now please don't misunderstand. There are times when it's deeply important for us to judge others. If you find yourself, for some odd reason, walking down the street in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco at midnight, and a person approaches you, it's important to make a snap judgment to know that that person is probably not your ally, your friend. If you are a female out with some friends, and a drunk comes up to you and compliments you on your dress, chances are this is not somebody who wants to get to know you intellectually. There are times when in order to survive, you absolutely must make judgments of others. But there are also times when we are not in a vulnerable position, when we casually go about life, when we think of someone else, someone who is different from us, when we see perhaps the limitations that they have, perhaps even the burdens that they carry, or maybe even understand the short stick that they have been given in life, that we think to ourselves dangerously, there but for the grace of God go I. Do we really know what we are saying when we say that? What we are saying is that that could be me, but because I have God's grace and that person doesn't, I'm better. We're saying, thank you, God, that you did not make me like that poor person. We may not mean it, but in doing so, we completely objectify other people. But of course, that there are some people who absolutely do mean when they objectify others. They truly do believe that they have been given divine superiority. They believe that God has truly blessed them over others. They believe that because of their health or their wealth, that God favors them. Which is to say that their impression is that those who have no health or wealth, well, simply too bad, so sad. At its very least, we call this prosperity gospel. And it is all around us. It is not only in our culture, but it is in the minds of many in the church. At its worst, however, we call this racism. At its worst, it becomes the justification to hurt or harm other people who are somehow different from you, who don't measure up to your belief or understanding of what it means to be a good citizen of the United States, what it means to be a good Christian. This is the stuff that hate groups feed on. Such seems to be the opening door of the danger that the Pharisee has walked through. He isn't a bad guy. I mean, for all intents and purposes, you wouldn't mind sitting next to him for a 4-hour flight or sitting next to him in church. It's just that he added that one phrase, like that Pharisee over there. That was the voice of self-centered superiority. And it was at that moment, that precise moment, that God stopped listening to his prayer. There is no place for superiority thinking in the church, and there certainly is no place for racist ideology in the church. The tax collector, however, fully understands his lot in life. He understands who he is. He knows he's one who is in trouble. He knows he's messed up. He knows he doesn't belong in the temple. Jesus says that he stands far off. And he can only manage 6 words. Have mercy on me, a sinner. This tax collector doesn't even have a prayer. And yet, Jesus said, he goes down to his home justified. Now, chances are you've heard this story once or twice before, and it sits well with you. And you think to your mind, that's how it should work, right? Except what happened next week. I've said before, Jesus has a hard time telling the ending of his parables. So my question is, what happened next? What would it have been like if the next week the cleanly attired and clean-minded Pharisee reminded God again of how blessed he is, and the tax collector shows up again Now this time, maybe with a few more coins in his pocket from his taxation work, and yet he intones the same prayer. Have mercy on me. Well, guess what? The Pharisee would again, and the tax collector would again. One would be justified and one would not. The tax collector receiving the voice of justification by God. Week after that, the same thing happens. The week after that, the very same thing happens. Now, let me ask, how heartwarming is this story for you? Or how offensive has it become? I mean, you're thinking probably that as the story unfolded, it starts with a good beginning, but the future, wouldn't we expect that there be some sort of amendment of behavior on the part of the tax collector? I mean, in other words, wouldn't we want the tax collector just to learn how to become a good Christian? Some commentators that I looked at this week wondered, well, where is it in the story that the tax collector repented? The fact is, he didn't repent. And it wouldn't have mattered one bit had he repented. Because the story isn't about our righteousness, and it's not about our piddly attempts at self-improvement, and it's not about our crying our eyes out or feeling suitably bad about what we become or messed up in life. No, quite the contrary. Our situation is hopeless. This story really isn't about a Pharisee, nor is it about a tax collector. It's about the one who listens to prayers, or doesn't. God. It seems the point at which God begins to hear our prayers is when we come to God with empty hands, with humble hearts, and with yearning souls. It's like only when we are empty, God can say, I can work with that. If we have any sense of superiority, or believe that we have earned or deserved God's favor, we're dead in the water. Martin Luther once said, God creates out of nothing. So therefore, until a man is nothing, God cannot do anything. So where do we go from here? Well, as it applies to how we see ourselves in relation to others, it appears that it is all about being empty. Humbly empty. So I'm sitting in my seat, 29C. The C means that it's an aisle seat. 29B has not shown up yet. And I watch people come down the aisle and I'm thinking to myself, do I want that person sitting next to me? Finally, one does come down, and while I'm not against tattoos, he had a number of tattoos up and down his arms. It's when the tattoos start going up the neck, that's when I start getting a little concerned. That wasn't a problem so much as the guy's t-shirt. It was a Confederate flag. And he stopped, and he looked at me, and he said, I'm 29B. And I thought to myself, God, I cannot believe you did this. And then I stopped. Because I had already prepared my sermon. I knew what today was going to be about. And as he shimmied by me, he said, so how are you doing today? And all I could say was, empty. God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Amen. The peace of the Lord be with you always. Thank you. I invite you to rise and share the peace of Christ with those who are near you.